criticizes Mark's research, so hopefully Mark will send in his response. But this is very important stuff. I don't know if you realized when you did your PhD on this that you chose to do Soviet agriculture back there in the late 80s, right?
Yeah,
you started
91.
What's that?
I finished in 91.
Yeah, you finished in 91, but you must have started before that. I don't know if you realized how important this topic would end up being.
Well, politically, yeah.
Yeah, okay, you did. Well, that's good. I certainly, in 1991, I would not have realized that. But that's really good. Very, very important research by Professor Tauger. So I just want to draw your attention to that. Now, I'm going to give a talk. I'm going to read it because it's more efficient that way. It's about 34 minutes long. And then there should be plenty of time for Q&A and so forth. But before I do that, let me just say what all this stuff here on this table is. I have flyers about each of my books. All right, so you can take a flyer if you're interested. I have copies of four of my 5 books. John just bought one of them. I only bought single copies of these. Brought single copies of these fatter books because they're pretty heavy, pretty clumsy to read. These are $20 a piece. My latest book, Yezhov versus Stalin, which is about the Great Terror, so-called, is $15. It's shorter, it's more readable, and I have multiple copies of that. So we can deal with that afterwards if anyone wants any. And I would ask you to take some of the flyers in any case. All right? So we'll take care of that at that time, right? Okay. So the title of this talk, let me just do it. The title of this talk is Reclaiming the History of the Russian Revolution. The Russian Revolution was the pivotal event of the 20th century. It and the other communist-led revolutions and the revolts against colonialism that it spurred and supported were the greatest movement for human liberation in history. The Stalin period, or period of Joseph Stalin's leadership of the Bolshevik Party in the Soviet state, is the heroic period of Soviet history. The greatest achievements of the Soviet Union and many of the great victories of the communist movement internationally took place during this period. Some of those triumphs are the collectivization of agriculture, putting an end to the 1,000-year cycle of severe and murderous famines suffered by Russia and Ukraine, the industrialization of this backward peasant country in a period of a decade to the point whereby the Soviet Union had the industrial means to defeat the Nazi Wehrmacht, the German army that had defeated every European army. The fight against racism within the multi-ethnic Soviet Union, and the spread of the ideology and practice of combating racism throughout the world, for example, to the American Communist Party. The fight against sexism and the promotion of women into jobs and professions from which they had been previously debarred. The conquest of illiteracy and the spread of quality education, the provision to all Soviet citizens of low-cost housing, transportation, health care, guaranteed vacations, and old age pensions. Internationally, the Communist International, or Comintern, during the period of Stalin's leadership, spread the communist movement into virtually every country on earth, where the communist parties led the struggles against exploitation, racism, imperialism, sexism, and for workers' rights. The Comintern spearheaded revolutions against capitalism and for socialism in China, Vietnam, Korea, Albania, and Yugoslavia. The Comintern helped to organize the independence struggles of many colonial peoples from the murderous domination of the so-called Western democracies. These so-called democracies had never granted democracy to any of their colonial peoples, but held onto them as long as possible in order to exploit their labor and raw materials to the maximum. In some cases, the Soviet Union provided huge amounts of material and human aid, both to the battle for independence and to the struggle for economic development. We in the United States owe the few social welfare benefits we have, unemployment insurance, workmen's compensation, social security, the civil rights laws, and the great public works projects of the WPA, to the fear that American capitalists had for communist revolution because of the example of the Stalin-led Soviet Union. It is no exaggeration then to call the communist movement of the 20th century, especially during the Stalin period, the greatest movement for human liberation ever. These great actions and achievements are the reason why so many lies about Stalin and the Soviet history of the Stalin period are propagated. These lies serve to obscure and deny the triumphs of the communist movement of the 20th century. At the same time, they prevent us from understanding what really happened in the Soviet Union during this time. That means they prevent us from learning the lessons, positive and negative, that we must learn from this history. In this talk, I will review my own research on some of the lies about Stalin and the Stalin-era Soviet Union. I have discussed most of these issues in depth with reference to the relevant primary and secondary sources in my books and articles, and I'll briefly mention some of those. I will also talk briefly about the so-called Great Terror of 1937-38 in the Soviet Union, with reference to my latest book, Yezhov versus Stalin, The Truth About Mass Repressions and the So-Called Great Terror in the Soviet Union. Khrushchev lied. In terms of its practical impact on world history, Khrushchev's secret speech is the most influential speech of the 20th century. In it, Khrushchev painted Stalin as a bloodthirsty tyrant guilty of a reign of terror lasting more than 2 decades. As a direct result of this speech, about 1/2 of all members of communist parties in the non-communist bloc quit their parties within 2 years. After the 22nd Party Congress of 1961, where Khrushchev and his men attacked Stalin with even more venom, many Soviet historians elaborated Khrushchev's lies. These falsehoods were repeated by Cold War anti-communists like Robert Conquest. They also entered left discourse through the works of Trotskyists and anarchists, and of pro-Moscow communists, who of course had to accept Khrushchev's version. Khrushchev's lies are amplified during Mikhail Gorbachev's and Boris Yeltsin's time by professional Soviet, then Russian historians. Gorbachev orchestrated an avalanche of anti-communist falsehoods that provided the ideological smokescreen for the return to exploitative practices within the Soviet Union, and ultimately for the abandonment of Soviet socialist reforms and a return to predatory capitalism, which they have now. During 2005 and 2006, I researched and wrote the book, Khrushchev Lied. Right? This is it. In my book, I identify 61 accusations that Khrushchev made against either Stalin or, in a few cases, Beria. I then studied each one of them in the light of evidence available from former Soviet archives. To my own surprise, I found that 60 of the 61 accusations are provably, demonstrably false. The fact that Khrushchev could falsify everything and get away with it for over 50 years suggests that we should look carefully at other supposed crimes of Stalin and of the Soviet Union during his time. The murder of Sergei Kirov. Okay, that's my second book here. At about 4:30 p.m. on December 1st, 1934, Leonid Vasilievich Nikolaev, an unemployed party member, shot Sergei Mironovich Kirov, first secretary of the Bolshevik Party in Leningrad, in the back of the skull, killing him. Nikolaev then tried to shoot himself in the head, but missed and fainted. At first, Nikolaev seemed to have claimed that he had killed Kirov on his own. But within a week, he had admitted that he was a part of a conspiracy by a clandestine group of party members opposed to Stalin and favoring Grigory Zinoviev, Leningrad first secretary before Kirov. Interrogations of those whom Nikolaev had named, and then of the persons named by those men, led to a number of partial and a few fuller confessions. 3 weeks after the murder, 14 men were indicted for conspiracy to kill Kirov. They were tried on December 28th to 29th, 1934, convicted, and executed immediately. The larger significance of the Kirov murder unfolded gradually during the next 3 years. The threads that bound the Kirov conspirators to Zinoviev and Kamyanev led to the 3 Moscow show trials of 1936, 37, and 38, and to the trial of the military commanders known as the Tukhachevsky affair of 1937. In his secret speech, Khrushchev cast doubt on the official version of the Kirov assassination. Khrushchev's men tried hard to find evidence that Stalin had been behind Kirov's murder. Unable to do so, they settled at length for a story that Nikolaev had acted on his own. However, the version that Stalin had caused Kirov to be killed continued to circulate, becoming widely believed both inside and outside the Soviet Union. Since 1990, the view officially accepted in Russia has been that Nikolaev acted alone, and that Stalin used Kirov's murder to frame former or putative rivals, forcing them to admit to crimes they had never committed, and executing them and ultimately many thousands more. In my 2013 book, The Murder of Sergei Kirov, History, Scholarship, and the Anti-Stalin Paradigm, I review all the evidence as objectively as possible, with appropriate skepticism, and without any preconceived conclusion in mind. The main conclusion of my study is that Nikolaev was not a lone gunman at all. The Soviet investigators and prosecution got it right in December 1934. A clandestine Zinoviev conspiratorial organization with ties to Trotskyists and rightists murdered Kirov. Timothy Snyder, Bloodlands, Europe Between Hitler and Stalin. In 2010, Timothy Snyder, a full professor of Eastern European history at Yale University, published Bloodlands. This book is the most successful attempt to date to equate Stalin with Hitler, the Soviet Union with Nazi Germany, and communism with Nazism. It garnered rave reviews in dozens of newspapers and journals, received prizes for historiography, and has been translated into more than 25 languages. Snyder says little about the Nazis. His main target is Stalin, Soviet policy, and communists generally. He claims that the Soviets killed 6 to 9 million innocent civilians, while the Nazis were killing about 14 million. Snyder finds parallels between the Soviets and the Nazis at every turn. I spent 2.5 years methodically checking every single footnote, every reference to anything that could be construed as a crime by Stalin, the Soviet Union, or pro-Soviet communists in Snyder's book. Snyder's main sources are in Polish and Ukrainian, and hard to find books and articles. I found that every so-called crime Snyder alleges is false, a fabrication. Snyder often deliberately lies about what his sources say. More often, he cites anti-communist Polish and Ukrainian secondary sources that do the lying for him. Once again, not a single accusation is true. The significance of this wholesale falsification is important, I feel. For one thing, Snyder's book is now widely quoted as an authority. Snyder said it in Bloodlands, so it is established as a fact. But the broader significance of Snyder's wholesale lying and falsifying is this. Snyder had a team of very anti-communist Polish and Ukrainian nationalist researchers to help him. It is their work which he is basically retailing to an English-speaking audience. Snyder himself has spent many years researching Eastern Europe between the world wars. And yet, Snyder could not find a single genuine crime by the Soviet Union, Stalin, or even by pro-communist groups. Surely this team of dedicated anti-communists, armed with the support of their post-Soviet states, access to archives, and knowledge of all the Eastern European languages, would have discovered real crimes of Stalin or of the Soviet Union if any existed. My book on Snyder's Bloodlands, entitled Blood Lies, was published in September 2014, and John just bought my only copy here. Hold on. There it is. Hey. Great. The Lies of Leon Trotsky. Shortly after the Leon Trotsky Archive at Harvard's Houghton Library was opened in January 1980, Trotskyist historian Pierre Brouet discovered letters between Leon Sedov, that is Trotsky's son, and his father Trotsky that proved the existence of a bloc between Trotskyists and other opposition groups within the Soviet Union. At about the same time, American historian Arch Getty was discovering that Trotsky had secretly sent letters to at least Karl Radek, Grigory Sokolnikov, and Preobrazhensky. They had been Trotskyists before publicly recanting their views. Getty did not find the letters themselves, only the certified mail receipts for them. Getty realized this meant that the Trotsky archive had been purged. These letters had been removed. We now know that other materials were removed as well. These missing materials would have seemed incriminating, negatively impacting Trotsky's reputation. The letters that we know were removed proved at the very least that Trotsky lied during the 1930s by claiming he never maintained contact with oppositionists inside the Soviet Union, when in reality he was doing so, and by claiming he had never agreed to a secret bloc between his supporters and other oppositionist groups, when in fact he had done precisely that. In my book, Trotsky's Amalgams, 2015, that's that one, I devote 2 chapters to the Dewey Commission. This was a group set up supposedly to study the charges against Trotsky that had been made during the first and second Moscow trials of August 1936 and January 1937. Eventually, the Dewey Commission published 2 fat volumes, one of the hearings themselves entitled The Case of Leon Trotsky, and the second of the Commission's study of the evidence and their conclusions, titled Not Guilty. I discovered that neither of these works had been re-examined in the light of the evidence now available from the Trotsky archive at Harvard and from the former Soviet archives. Though there have been at least 10 full-scale biographies of Trotsky published since the end of the Soviet Union in 1991, not a single one of them has undertaken to re-examine the Dewey Commission. In addition, I discovered a lot of other problems with the Dewey Commission, problems that should have caught the attention of any careful reader long ago. If the Dewey Commission members had known that Trotsky was lying to them, they could never have concluded, as they did, that Trotsky was not guilty. The Dewey Commission was and remains a world-class swindle. The evidence that Trotsky did conspire with the Germans and Japanese. A decade ago, I began to collect primary source evidence on the question of whether Leon Trotsky did indeed conspire with the German and Japanese military, as alleged in the second and third Moscow trials. In 2009, I published my article in the online journal Cultural Logic. There's a lot of evidence, and I spend even more space examining it. Now, the existence of this evidence must be accounted for in some way. Naturally, every individual piece of this evidence can be accounted for in multiple ways, by several different hypotheses. But there are only 2 hypotheses that can account for all of this evidence. 1, Trotsky did indeed conspire with the Germans and Japanese. Or 2, all of this evidence was fabricated, faked by Stalin or by NKVD leaders Yagoda and Yezhov, or both. This second hypothesis also requires evidence that this fakery or forgery took place in different places and at different times within the Soviet Union, and in documents which were never published and never intended to be published. I will examine all of this and more in my second book on Trotsky in the 1930s, to be titled Trotsky's Conspiracies. It is scheduled for publication in the fall of this year, 2017. The Moscow trials. The newly available evidence confirms the following conclusion. The defendants at the Moscow trials of August 1936, January 1937, and March 1938 were guilty of at least those crimes to which they confessed. A bloc of Rights and Trotskyites did indeed exist. It planned to assassinate Stalin, Kaganovich, Molotov, and others in a coup d'etat, which they called a palace coup. The bloc did assassinate Kirov. Both Rights and Trotskyites were conspiring with the Germans and Japanese, as were the military conspirators. If the palace coup did not work, they hoped to come to power by showing loyalty to Germany or Japan in the event of an invasion. Trotsky, too, was directly conspiring with the Germans and Japanese, as were a number of his supporters. Was the trial testimony falsified? All anti-communist scholars assume that the trial testimony was falsified in some way which they do not specify. It is easy to find historians of Soviet history who make this assumption. But it is impossible to find one who proves it, or indeed has any evidence for it at all. There has never been any evidence that the testimony at the Moscow trials was falsified, the defendants forced to mouth confession composed or dictated by others. But, though there is no evidence that the testimony in these trials was falsified, there is a lot of evidence to the contrary, that the testimony was genuine. Most of this evidence might be explained as faked if there were any evidence that the confessions and the alleged plots had been scripted by the NKVD. But there is no evidence of any such conspiracy to fabricate the trials. while we do have evidence that they were not scripted. I devote the first 12 chapters of my book, Trotsky's Amalgams, 60% of the entire book, to carefully checking and verifying those aspects of the Moscow trial testimony that we can now check from other sources. The Yezhovshchina, or Great Terror, of the summer of 1937 to the fall of 1938. Nikolai Yezhov, head of the NKVD, which stands for People's Commissariat of Internal Affairs, had his own conspiracy against the Soviet government and party leadership. Yezhov had also been recruited by German intelligence. Like the Wrights and Trotskyites, Yezhov and his top NKVD men were counting on an invasion by Germany, Japan, or other major capitalist country. They tortured a great many innocent people into confessing to capital crimes so they could be shot. They executed a great many more on falsified grounds or on no grounds at all. Yezhov hoped that this mass murder of innocent people would turn large parts of the Soviet population against the government. That would create the basis for internal rebellions against the Soviet government when Germany or Japan attacked. As early as October 1937, Stalin and the party leadership began to suspect that some of the repression was being done illegally. When Lavrenti Beria was appointed as Yezhov's second in command, Yezhov and his men understood that Stalin and the party leadership no longer trusted them. They made one last plot to assassinate Stalin at the November 7, 1938 celebration of the 21st anniversary of the Bolshevik Revolution. But Yezhov's men were arrested in time. Yezhov was persuaded to resign. An intensive investigation was begun, and a huge number of NKVD abuses were uncovered. A great many cases of those tried or punished under Yezhov were reviewed. Over 100,000 people were released from prisons and camps during Beria's first year. How could this happen? From the evidence now available, it appears that there were two kinds of conspiracies against Stalin and the Soviet leadership. The first were the oppositionists, Zinoviev, Trotsky, the rightists like Bukharin, and the military conspirators like Marshal Tukhachevsky. The second group was comprised of party officials who bitterly opposed the Stalin Constitution of 1936. They were especially hostile to 2 points in it: contested elections for the Soviets, the legislative branch of government, and putting political power into the hands of the Soviets rather than into the hands of party officials, or rather taking it out of the hands of party officials and giving it to the Soviets. Stalin, it appears, was trying to carry out one of the basic demands of the revolution of 1917, all power to the Soviets. This threatened the dominance of party leaders over all areas of economic and political life. Under Beria, the number of executions in 1939 and 1940 dropped to less than 1% of the number under Yezhov in 1937 and 38. And many of those executed were NKVD men, including Yezhov himself, who were found to be guilty of massive unjustified repression and executions of innocent people. Anti-communist scholars hide the truth. All anti-communist and Trotskyist researchers falsely claim that there were no conspiracies. According to them, all the Moscow trial defendants, all the military defendants, and all those tried in sentences for espionage, conspiracy, sabotage, and other crimes were innocent victims. Some claim that Stalin had planned to kill all these people because they might constitute a fifth column, a font of disloyal people, if the Soviet Union were attacked. Other anti-communists prefer the explanation that Stalin just tried to terrorize the population into obedience. This is an ideological anti-communist stance masquerading as a historical conclusion. It is not based upon the historical evidence and is inconsistent with that evidence. Anti-communist historians ignore the primary source evidence available. They even ignore evidence in collections of documents that they themselves cite in their own works. Why do they do this? Why do they continue to promote the false notions that no conspiracies existed and that Stalin, not Yezhov, decided to execute hundreds of thousands of innocent people? The only possible explanation is that they do this for ideological reasons alone. The truth, as established by an examination of the primary source evidence, would make Stalin and the Bolsheviks look good to many people. Objectivity and evidence. I agree with historian Jeffrey Roberts, well-known historian of the Soviet Union, when he says, quote, "In the last 15 years or so, an enormous amount of new material on Stalin has become available from Russian archives. I should make it clear that, as a historian, I have a strong orientation to telling the truth about the past, no matter how uncomfortable or unpalatable the conclusions may be. I don't think there is a dilemma. You just tell the truth as you see it. The conclusions I have reached about the Yezhovshchina, or Great Terror, will be unacceptable to ideologically motivated people. I have not reached these conclusions out of any desire to apologize for the policies of Stalin or the Soviet government. I believe these to be the only objective conclusions possible based upon the available evidence." The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact of August 1939. At a conference some years back, a liberal anti-communist threw the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, often called by anti-communists the Hitler-Stalin Pact, in my face. How could I defend it? He virtually shouted at me. I realized that I did not know nearly as much about it as I should, so I spent the summer of 2009 researching it. The result is a monograph-sized article entitled, quote, "Did the Soviet Union invade Poland in September 1939? The answer, no, it did not." You can read it with 17 web pages of evidence and documentation on my homepage. I learned a lot. For one thing, I learned that the pact was not an alliance, although it is often called an alliance between the Soviet Union and Hitler's Germany. I learned that the Soviet Union did not invade Poland in September 1939. I'll try to put that in a provocative way. Maybe somebody will respond. And that all the Allies agreed at the time that it did not. I learned that the Soviet Union was the only country that acted properly in the pre-war period. This is the only conclusion I could honestly reach. I discussed this question at even more length in my recent book, Blood Lies. The Katyn Massacre. In April 1943, Nazi German authorities claimed that they had discovered thousands of bodies of Polish officers shot by Soviet officials in 1940 near the Katyn forest near Smolensk in western Russia. The Nazi propaganda machine organized a huge campaign around this alleged discovery. After the Soviet victory at Stalingrad in February 1943, it was obvious to everyone that, unless something happened to split the Allies, Germany would inevitably lose the war. The Nazis' obvious aim was to drive a wedge between the Western Allies and the Soviet Union. The Soviet government, headed by Joseph Stalin, vigorously denied the German charge. When the Polish government in exile in London, always ferociously anti-communist and anti-Russian, collaborated with the Nazi propaganda effort, the Soviet government broke diplomatic relations with it. During the Cold War, the Western capitalist countries supported the Nazi version, now promoted by the anti-communist Poles. The Soviet Union and its allies continued to blame the Germans until, in 1989 to 1992, Mikhail Gorbachev and Boris Yeltsin stated that the Soviet Union under Joseph Stalin had indeed shot the Poles. At the beginning of 2013, I learned about archaeological findings at a German mass murder site in Ukraine. Because I had been following the dispute over the Katyn Massacre for many years, I recognized the implications of these findings. They provide material evidence that the Soviet Union could not have shot the Polish prisoners of war in 1940. The discoveries in the mass graves at Volodymyr Volhynsky, Ukraine, constitute a lethal blow to the official version of the Katyn Massacre. This is something that should interest us all. Katyn has been the most famous crime alleged against Stalin and the Soviet government. It has hitherto also been the crime most firmly grounded in documentary evidence. I have recently completed researching and writing a book-length study of the Katyn Massacre. That's not quite true. I've completed 5 drafts, but I need to write at least 1 or 2 more drafts. It will be published in March or April of next year, in other words, in about a year. In this book, I study all the primary source evidence and all the important secondary sources. On the evidence, there is no question that the Germans, not the Soviets, were guilty. Katyn has been the best documented crime of Stalinism, and it's a lie. The hoax of the Holodomor. During the Civil War of 1918 to 1921, anti-communist Ukrainian nationalists were used by the Germans as a force to fight the Bolsheviks. During the 1930s, they were trained by German fascists. During World War II, Ukrainian nationalist forces fought alongside the German army and swore allegiance to Adolf Hitler. They engaged in mass murders of Jews and other Soviet citizens, and in a true genocide against Polish civilians in German-occupied Ukraine in 1943 to 44. After the war, many fled to Western Europe, the USA, and especially to Canada. In the USA, they were supported for decades by the CIA. They developed two false histories. One was that the Ukrainian nationalist forces were freedom fighters who had fought against both Hitler and Stalin. The second was that Stalin, the communist, had deliberately caused the 1932 to 1933 famine in the Ukrainian SSR as an attempt to wipe out Ukrainian nationalist sentiment among the peasantry. This they called the Holodomor, a word they coined meaning death by starvation, invented to sound like Holocaust. A more liberal anti-communist version of the famine is that it was caused by the collectivization of agriculture. There has never been any evidence at all to support these falsehoods, and there still isn't. But they are embraced by Ukrainian nationalists in order to try to justify their Nazi collaboration and massacres of civilians. The Holodomor hoax is spread by Trotskyists as well, since two of Trotsky's last essays were in support of Ukrainian nationalism. When Trotsky wrote, the only Ukrainian nationalists were fascists. Trotsky had to know that. Early this month, I published a short article about this in Counterpunch, the online journal, where you can read it. I also devote the first 2 chapters of my book, Blood Lies, to exposing the phony Holodomor and Timothy Snyder's dishonest attempts to find evidence to support this Nazi lie. And to be honest, you'll see it, I support it thanks to Professor Mark Tauber's research, right? Not my own, but his. So attack him, not me. Why all the lies? Here is the situation. Khrushchev lied. All the experts lie about the murder of Sergei Kirov. Leon Trotsky lied. Timothy Snyder lied, and so do all his expert colleagues in Eastern Europe who have the financial support of their right-wing anti-communist governments and access to archives. The mainstream version of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, which the anti-communists call the Hitler-Stalin Pact, is false. The so-called definitive studies of the Katyn massacre are fraudulent. The Holodomor is a Nazi-inspired lie. All the scholars who run in the so-called Great Terror ignore the evidence, and therefore they're lying too. That's a lot of lying, right? Let's think about that. Why would all these people lie about Stalin and the Stalin-era Soviet Union if they knew of any real, demonstrable, provable crimes of what they call Stalinism? The only possible conclusion is they can't find a single real, provable crime that Stalin and the Soviets committed. This is the best evidence we will probably ever have that there were no such crimes. Conclusion. I began this talk by pointing out that the Bolshevik Revolution was the inception of the greatest movement for human liberation in world history. No wonder then that the capitalists and imperialists and their dishonest scholars revile, slander, and lie about it. In this talk, I have touched on a few of the more important events of Soviet history of the 1930s. In conclusion, I would like to say something about objectivity and the attempt to discover the truth. Almost all the books and articles published today about Soviet history of the Stalin period are framed and therefore controlled by what I call the anti-Stalin paradigm. In Western academic discussion, it is obligatory, required, that a researcher come to conclusions that confirm the anti-communist portrayal of Stalin as a vicious, evil killer and dictator, and the Soviet Union as a site of mass murder and cruelty. If you are unwilling to put your research within this biased framework, you simply can't have an academic career. I have been told by 2 fine researchers in Soviet history, researchers who are not leftists but who strive to be objective, that no book that is not hostile to Stalin can be published by an academic publisher. That is certainly true in the West, and I believe it to be true in Russia too. A lot of people on the right do not want the truth about the history of the communist movement in the Soviet Union during the Stalin years to come to light. They want to continue to demonize it, to compare it to Hitler and fascism, and to lie about it. And that's what they do. Not only passively through their point of view or bias, but actively by deliberately falsifying the evidence, sources, and history. Marx and Engels wrote that the proletariat has nothing to lose but its chains. By that, I assume they meant that we have no sacred cows, nothing we refuse to subject to critical scrutiny. We want to cast aside all illusions and falsehoods. Only the truth shall make us free if we are against all exploitation of man by man. Marx's favorite slogan was De omnibus dubitandum, which means question everything, and your preconceived ideas and biases above all others. If you want to learn the truth, that's what you must do. And Marx himself would be the last person to make an exception of his own writings, okay? This is what I try hard to do. None of the demonizers of Stalin and the Soviet Union, the anti-communist experts on the history of the communist movement, make any attempt to be objective. They don't discover the truth then because they don't want to do so. They want to write propaganda with footnotes, and that's what their works are. In my view, the importance of all this new evidence and research lies mainly in proving the utter dishonesty of the mainstream accounts of Soviet history. Accounts that pass for the truth, not only among Cold War anti-communists, not only among Trotskyists, but also the mainstream view among Marxists and communists. For example, Louis Proyect's recent essays in Counterpunch, right? Which is, I guess, about the most left-wing popular journal that exists in the United States. We Marxists ought to be relieved. All around the world, the horror stories about Stalin and the Stalin period are employed to discredit Marxism, socialism, and communism. Now we can see these horror stories are lies. The communist movement in the Soviet Union did not lead to communism. Instead, it led back to capitalism. Obviously, the Bolsheviks made serious errors. But these are the errors not of criminals and murderers, but of pioneers. The Bolsheviks are blazing an unmarked trail, going where no man had gone before. Remember Star Trek? In this sense, then, they were not even errors, but part of the process of learning how to build communism. But we who come after them must carefully study what they did. We will never discover what those errors were, or what the Bolsheviks did that was right, correct, admirable, worthy of imitation, unless we know what really happened. A new and better communist movement can only be rebuilt upon the sound foundation of historical truth, not upon the sand of anti-communist lies. I am glad to be playing a small part in the effort to uncover this true history. Thank you. Okay, so are we going to take a break, or are we going to have the Q&A right now? Here comes somebody else. Very good. Came at just the right time. The talk's over. Just the pizza's left.
Well, actually, I was wondering.
Go ahead.
Because a lot of people in the room might not be familiar with it.
Yes.
But Stalin's fight for democracy, which you talked
Okay.
about.
Well, the first half, or more or less, well, first third to a half. Actually, I didn't measure it, but maybe 30–40% of this book is about Stalin's fight for democracy, fight for the 1936 Constitution to be implemented. The 1936 Soviet Constitution called for contested elections, secret, universal, secret and contested elections for the Soviets. That is to say, at least two candidates for each position, and was never implemented. And the struggle to get the Constitution approved, led by Stalin and his supporters within the leadership, and then how that struggle was ultimately defeated is the subject of the first third, let's say, to 40% of my latest book. I know it was also the subject of an article that I published, let's say, 11 or 12 years ago. But I have updated the research and included it here as a part of this book, because it turns out that that is related also to the so-called Great Terror in interesting ways. Okay. When I said, by the way, let me just throw something out. in my view, a lot of concepts that are used rather loosely, I would say, on the left, of course also by anti-communists, but now let me just talk about some that are used on the left. A lot of concepts are insufficiently critiqued or examined or detailed, spelled out. For example, I referred to Stalin's attempt to introduce contested elections, democracy, as a desire to return all power to the Soviets. All right, that was one of the slogans of the Bolshevik Party in 1917 before they seized state power. And that's true as far as it goes, but I don't think it's entirely true. If the 1936 Constitution had been put in place along with the contested elections, Stalin said many times that he was prepared for non-communists and even anti-communists to get elected. But I'm sure they would not have permitted, for example, capitalism to have been voted back into power. All right? I don't think, therefore, that the term all power to the Soviets is really accurate. I think all power within the framework of keeping the Bolshevik Party in power, at least keeping the socialism in existence. So that slogan needs to be re-examined and discussed, and we need to figure out exactly what was meant and what we should mean by it. Another big topic that really needs to be critically examined is the concept of socialism. Just what does socialism mean? Many people say we're fighting for socialism, but what concretely does that mean? After all, Gorbachev and and Brezhnev and the other leaders of the Soviet Union all claimed to be fighting for socialism. So clearly, they were able to implement many capitalist-style changes under the guise that of fighting for socialism. So the whole concept of socialism needs to be spelled out, needs to be rethought, needs to be examined and critiqued. What did the Soviets mean by it? What did the Second International mean by it? What did the Chinese mean by it today? And what can we learn from that? What changes should be made in that concept in the future? So there are a lot of concepts that we've inherited from the old communist movement of the 20th century that need to be revisited, re-examined critically. All right? And certainly the collapse of socialism in the Soviet Union, the return to capitalism, should impel us to look, to try to identify and trace the origins of the errors that the Bolsheviks made. Clearly, they made significant errors, very significant errors. Ultimately, the errors overcame whatever they did that was correct. And in my view, the errors go way back. All right? Khrushchev came from somewhere. Khrushchev lied, but Khrushchev came from somewhere. He was a major party leader in the 1930s. How could somebody like that get power? And many other concepts, I think, go way back. I have some views as to what they might be and how far back they might go. I won't get into that now. But I think it would be a big mistake to say, as a few people say, not too many so far, I'm glad to say that, well, if we could only get Stalin back. If only Stalin's followers had continued to his policies instead of changing them, then everything would have been all right. I don't think I don't think that could possibly be true. Any other questions? Yes, ma'am. Jessica.
Yeah, the gentleman who killed Yeshov, right? What was his explanation? Because it was supposed to be a suicide. I'm sorry, not Kirov, I'm sorry.
Guy who shot
I'm sorry, I
Kirov.
was in the hospital, I'm still not right.
Well, you know, I don't remember all of the details. It's in my book.
Right, right.
We have a certain number of primary sources. The interesting thing about it is this. Let me just say this. When I wrote this book, and when the 3 books that I critique, the 3 Western studies of Kirov's assassination that I critique at the beginning of that book, were written, the Soviet archives on the Kirov assassination were still not open. There was still stuff that you couldn't see. Now, that may still be the case, but I don't think anybody has looked. There's a law in Russia that says that everything, all these documents should be made public, available to the public after 75 years. So 75 years from 1934 was like 2009, right? So when this material was written, when the books that I'm reacting to were researched and written, that 75 years was not yet over. Now, if I were to do this book again, I'm not planning on doing that, but if I were to do this book again, things might be different. It might be possible now to get a lot more of that information. Although, I know from my contact with my colleague Vladimir Bobrov in Moscow, that in fact, the FSB, which is the organization, the successor to the KGB and the NKVD, who still has the archives to the NKVD and the KGB, they are not, in fact, releasing files of people who have not been rehabilitated. Okay, not been rehabilitated. That's against the law, but my colleague Vladimir and his friend who used this archive have decided that they would prefer to maintain their good relationship with the archivists rather than bring a lawsuit and you know, cause a lot of friction between them and the archivists. So that even though it, strictly speaking, seems to be against the law, they're not going to challenge that right now. So we don't know about the Kirov assassination. We do know we can't, for example, get Yezhov's file because he was never rehabilitated. At the end of this book, very interesting, the last chapter 15, the testimony of Stanislav Frantsevich Redins. Just a word about that. Redins was an NKVD man. He was one of Yezhov's key guys. He was executed. He was tried and executed for massive repression. But he had high-placed relatives. He was an in-law of Stalin's, for example, although Stalin had nothing to do with this personally. But he had high-placed relatives. So when Khrushchev started to rehabilitate people, okay, which is just saying, you know, we're declaring you innocent, you know, the charges against you are declaring them false, Redins was rehabilitated. There's even a report on him that says, well, you know, he really shouldn't be rehabilitated, but it's not practical not to rehabilitate him. In the 80s, his case was revisited, and there's apparently either the Supreme Court or the military commission said about Redins, well, this guy should never have been rehabilitated, you know. But the what do they call it? The period of time had passed. They couldn't reverse the decision, or the statute of limitations, we call it in America, right? There's a different word in Russian. The statute of limitations had passed. They could not unrehabilitate him. So therefore, we have, thanks to my friend Vladimir, whose friend Mr. Ushkalov went into the archive and got it, and then transcribed it and sent it to me, we have Redin's file, which we shouldn't have, right? Because he should never have been rehabilitated, but he was. Well, there's lots of other very interesting people who are not rehabilitated. It'd be great to get their files. But there are a lot of people whose files we could probably get who nobody's asking for. As far as I know, nobody's asking for them. Nobody's going there and saying, okay, I'm going to come in here and I'm going to copy all this stuff out by hand. You know, it might take weeks and weeks to do it, and then take it back and retype it. Or maybe you're allowed to take laptops in there now. I don't know. Maybe you're allowed to take photographs, right? To take digital photos. It's not clear to me. I remember a few months ago I asked Vladimir to ask his friends, can you now go in there and take and use a digital photograph, a camera to take pictures of this? Evidently, the archives are not well organized. A lot depends on personal contacts. They're much more open. Yeah, go ahead, Mark.
Well, in St. Petersburg, someone was working for me. They finally figured out that it's better to let people take pictures with their phone than to go through the process of scanning because it pulls the art damages.
Okay, so maybe we're getting
like that.
the FSB archive, at least the one that I got this stuff from, is in Moscow. But maybe, so I don't know if there's a uniform policy, but maybe it's coming to that. That would be great, right? Yes. If you can do that, that would make it a lot easier. So we're in a position now when the entire 1930s is more than 75 years ago. Okay, so what's really needed is for an army of researchers to go into the archives and start copying and publishing as much as they possibly can. But I don't know that that's really happening at this point. My sense is that it isn't happening, but it could happen. Okay, so meanwhile, my colleague Vladimir, you have a researcher going there. My colleague Vladimir and his friend are getting certain things and sending them to me and using them themselves, and so more stuff is coming out. But that's the situation right now. It's very different from the United States, right? In the United States, any little minor issue of American history, the professional and the amateur historians descend on it, and everything gets publicized and argued about. So that's not the case with the history of the 1930s in Russia. Yeah.
Yeah, just one thing. Bring some of the issues up to date, particularly with the so-called Holodomor. Is that now there's a new movie called Bitter Harvest?
Well, that's what. Yeah.
Which is, I mean, there's a dual-pronged attack on this. One is obviously to denigrate Stalin and the Soviet Union and so on, but in a more direct sense to give credence to these neo-fascists who are running Ukraine today with gotten into power with the help of the U.S. government.
Yeah, sure.
Hillary Clinton and among others, right? So they want to use this to justify today their campaign against.
Yeah, and there's a big at the Ukrainian mission, the Ukrainian embassy in Washington D.C. There's a big kind of wall type memorial called a memorial to the Holodomor, right? Holodomor, that's what they put outside. Mark, you saw the movie, right?
Oh yeah, I wrote a long essay on it. It's almost finished.
Oh great!
It doesn't deserve it.
Is it going to be published?
It doesn't deserve
It's a joke.
The movie.
Oh, it's a joke. You want me to explain an example?
Sure, why not?
All right. Has anyone seen the movie? No one's seen it?
Waiting to get it on bootleg.
It was a pretty small release, right?
They advertised it on NPR, which is, I have never heard a movie advertised on NPR, so there must have been something going on. I called them, and they never answered, so what can I do? Well, it begins with, just as an example, it begins with these scenes of, happy peasants wearing very nice, clean, beautiful Ukrainian shirts that have the collar, the stripe, that's nice, and they're young men and young women, having parties and doing folk dancing and swimming in the lake and their children and talking, and one who wants to be an artist and all this, and it's supposed to be, you never find out that this is supposed to be taking place during World War I. The Russian army had recruited 11 million men. How come there were so many men? The Ukrainian peasants, like most of the other peasants in Russia, in the Russian Empire, were extremely poor. They wouldn't have, very rarely, you might have a nice shirt or something, but most of them were pretty poor. The villages were dominated, they were not egalitarian villages. They were not egalitarian in the treatment of men and women. The women were extremely subordinated. They would not have been relating in this way. And then the thing is that during it supposedly takes place during the revolution, but the only event that you hear about is that the Tsar was executed by the Bolsheviks, and then the peasants were free. Well, the thing is that the Tsar was executed by the Bolsheviks in July of 1918. Before that, there was this small event called the Russian Revolution in February 1917, when the Tsar was made to abdicate. That's when the peasants stopped being subordinate to the Tsar, but the peasants didn't care about the Tsar. The peasants looked to the Tsar as, you know, as someone who could protect them against the landlords. That's who they hated. And what they didn't show was that in 1917, after the Tsar was gone and the provisional government came in, the provisional government could stop the peasants from doing what they had wanted to do for decades, which was to take over the nobles' land, burn the landlords' estates, kill the landlords or kick them out. Maybe in a few cases, sometimes they'd give them a little bit of land over here, as long as they didn't cause any trouble, and steal everything they could from the estate. And if they couldn't steal it, there's an anecdote that's documented about a case. They had this piano, and what to do is just chopped it out. Peasants, and they didn't want to, I think the movies realized that you couldn't show this to American viewers and get them to like the peasants.
Yeah, sure.
And the thing that happened in 1918, well, what had happened was the Brest-Litovsk Treaty in March of 1918 that opened up Ukraine to German and Austria to obtain food for their starving cities. And so the German and Austrian military forces moved into Ukraine and started extracting food from the peasants, who rebelled quite violently, and it was a you know, rather violent period. And when you see the movie, nothing's happening. They're just playing, doing their folk dances. You know, it's insane.
Yeah, I guess, well, that, you know, as propaganda, I can't wait for your essay to be published.
I'll see if they'll let me.
So, yeah.
Has anyone ever seen, if you don't mind, just
Oh, please.
What's it called? The 1915 movie? What was it called? The one about the making of America or something?
Birth of a Nation.
Birth of a Nation.
Yeah.
Has anyone seen it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And you know how absurd it is?
Yeah.
Did you know? Like it shows the happy slaves, very obedient to the masters, and masters is totally indifferent to the slaves, and all they care about is, and then all of a sudden, the Civil War comes, and slaves become totally, now they're blacks, and they're all they want is white women,
Yeah.
and they're just violent, and you know, there was a criticism of this by the famous African-American historian. For being a historian, I forget things so often. Well, one of the sort of mid-20th century generation of African-American historians who wrote it in an obscure journal, but it's available on JSTOR.
Okay.
And he points out there isn't a single documented case of the kind of hostility of blacks towards whites in the Reconstruction period in the South that the movie is based on.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. So it's a similar kind of thing, is what you're saying. So, yeah.
Yeah.
I have a question for you about the movie. How was Stalin portrayed? Because I remember I saw in the coming attractions he was
They
just
have
like
these little vignettes in which they took, sometimes they took a passage that he sort of said completely out of context, and others they just make it up. Right? Like what they say, they have him say, Stalin saying that without Ukraine, Russia cannot survive, which is what Ukrainians want to say, because they say Ukraine was the breadbasket of Europe and all of this, which is completely false, because Russia produces more than double the amount of grain that Ukraine produces. Ukraine was largely, you know, it exported because it's a lot easier to ship from Odessa than it is from Saratov, which is way up there. So the Volga region released more supply Central Russia, although they did export as well. But the thing is that Ukraine was mainly producing was all these other kinds of things, like livestock, sugar beets, right? But Russia, you know, did produce a lot of grain. You know, Russia did not have Ukraine until the 17th century. So
Could you say something about, I don't want to take advantage of you being here, but you're so privileged to have Dr. Tauber here because he's the world expert on Soviet agriculture. Could you say something about the history of famines
God.
every 70 years in Russia.
Have
I
a
mean,
semester?
briefly. I think that what's happened is the 1932-33 famine is completely taken out of context in that sense too, as
Yeah,
though
well,
somehow or other there hadn't been
I
any
mean,
famines
there
before.
are a lot of things to say.
Well, you have that book by Borisenko and
Pasetsky,
Pasetsky.
Pasetsky and Pasetsky. Yeah, which is slightly problematic,
Okay.
but it does have a lot of information. Well, but the thing is that they have, has anyone ever studied China? It's not something you study when you study the history of these countries. There was a book published by the American Geographical Society by an American, he was a scientist. He was a Chinese specialist, and he went to China in 1921 because there was a big crop failure there and famine, and it was the Chinese Famine Relief Commission set up and worked there until the 1930s. And he published a book in 1926 through the American Geographical Society called China, Land of Famine. Have you ever heard of this?
No.
And China, and he sort of, he's had an introduction in environmental causes of famine, economic causes of famine, political causes of famine, and various attempts to solve these problems and so forth. And at the beginning he cited, or he referred to, he didn't cite, because if he had cited it, I'd have a source, but I can't find the source. He said that a group of students at Taiwan University, and this should give you an idea for a senior thesis, a group of students had looked through Chinese records, and they found that in the entire history of the Chinese empires, which went from the Han Dynasty until 1911, when the dynasties were
206 BC to
so, yeah, so about 2,000 years, there were 1,800 something famines. Some of them were this one here, and some of them were much larger. But the China, and the reason they had that is that China had a relief system, the ever normal granary. Ever heard of this? It was an important thing because it was one of the factors that led to the policies of the Great Depression in the United States. Because Henry Wallace, the Secretary of Agriculture, knew about China. And so what I'm trying to write is that Russia was also a land of famine, right, in a much shorter period of time. But they also had hundreds of crop failures, and they appear to have caused serious shortages and sometimes many famines in different regions, sometimes local and sometimes larger. And the difference is that it took the Russians a long time to figure out what to do about it. They dug holes in the ground and stored grain. They imported food. They tried to force, if there was a crisis like this where some peasants were starving and others were not, the Great came in and after hearing about it and finally getting done with his wars, he gave orders that they should take the grain from the wealthy people and leave them just enough for themselves and give the rest to these other people who should have to return it. And you might be able to predict that when we try to apply this, all of a sudden those wealthy people didn't seem to have any grain. So
there were like 3 or 4 famines, depending on how you count them, in the 1920s alone, right?
Yeah, there was. Yeah,
Crop
the thing is
failures,
that but this chronic problem of crop failures, and it's a very ambiguous story because at the same time they're having crop failures, and they finally got a system organized for famine relief in the 19th century that had many flaws and problems, and it was a matter of considerable dispute, and lots of things were written about it, complaining about it, criticizing it, trying to improve it, and the government switching from one extreme to the other, and so forth. But the problem was chronic, and it survived into the Soviet period. And in the 1920s, the Soviets actually perpetuated the Tsarist regime and set up famine relief commissions and imported food and distributed food to starving peasants and so forth. But and faced the same problem that the Russian government did. They basically saw the peasants as not incorrectly as backward and as ineffective farmers. And they thought that they could solve the problem by improving agriculture this way, but nothing could solve the problem. That's the problem. That's why they ended up importing food so much in the 1950s and 1960s and to the end of the 1980s. And mainly the only thing that's really helped them overcome it was what we call the Green Revolution, which is breeding high-yielding varieties. And one of the things that I'm researching is that there was actually a Soviet scientist who actually did more or less what Norman Borlaug was a Nobel Peace Prize in 1970 for his Green Revolution, developing very high-yielding grain varieties. There was actually a Soviet who did it independently, but unlike anywhere else in the world, they had to do it underground because it was a period of Lysenko. Has anyone heard of Lysenko? Trofim Lysenko was a pseudoscientist that got the favor of Stalin and thought that he believed in inheritance of acquired characters in a very crude and stupid way. For a few years there, he was pretty powerful.
What's the name of the scientist who did this?
Lysenko?
No, the one who did this was very similar to him. It was Pavel Lukyanenko.
Oh, yes.
Lukyanenko. Yes.
So you're writing about this?
I've already published a few articles about it.
Oh, good.
Yeah, so it's
That's right, you sent one.
Yeah.
Good. That's great. So anyway, this is the complex story. Yeah, I do say in one of my books here, maybe you can shoot me down, or maybe it's correct, I'm not sure, that with the exception of the 1946-47 famine, right? There was a serious famine, 46-47. This was the last of the famines, 1932-33, right? It's not like people were, not like there was abundance, but it was the last of these serious famines.
Yeah, well,
Is that correct, or am I wrong?
well, it's the last famine because 46-47 was the last one because after that Stalin died,
Yeah.
and the government began importing food.
Yeah.
They began importing food in 1953. It's not usually well known. It's in the documents that Khrushchev published, and
They had something to presumably had something to pay for.
well, they've always had things to pay for. Food, grain is cheap in world markets.
Okay.
You know, particularly during 1930, the early 30s. You know, this is the Great Depression. The food was cheap, the cheapest it's ever been. This is the biggest problem, is that Stalin didn't import food. And the problem was that I don't think they really understood what happened.
Mm-hmm.
This is, I mean, I haven't gone through all of the Stalin materials, but the materials that I've seen, they didn't know what happened.
Yeah,
The strongest, the evidence for what happened was only published after the famine was over.
Yeah, they didn't start getting aid and so forth to Ukraine until February 33, right? Something
Yeah,
like that.
well, I mean, that's
Before
actually
that, they
pretty
didn't
early.
know there was a.
Well, but there was aid that was provided in 32 as well.
Oh,
I mean,
okay.
the problem is that they didn't understand what happened, and it's not only really the scientists.
Okay, well, we're looking forward to your book. I mean, that's going to be
Yeah.
very good. So,
Yeah.
And maybe more
Thank
than
you
one.
for listening.
Sure.
Sorry.
Yeah.
I just want to bring up a point because you're mentioning the Cadden massacre.
Yes.
And what's interesting is that my mother, who grew up in Italy, one day I was hearing her having a conversation with my aunt in Italy. And I remember her saying, well, what do you mean you don't believe, and this had happened, this conversation took place a few days after the World Trade Center towers collapsed. She says, how can you possibly believe something so naive? I'm hearing my mother saying this to my aunt. Of course, we were involved. Don't you remember the fire that was set on the Parliament building in Germany?
Yeah.
And then
Reichstag.
Right, the Reichstag, right. But this is the way my mother phrased. Remember, the Parliament building, they burned that down, they blamed it on the Jews. And then she said, oh, and of course, the massacre of the Polish military officers.
Mm-hmm.
That was blamed on the Russians instead of the Germans. And then she began mentioning a few other things.
Mm-hmm.
And, but the point was, when I came back and asked my mother says, oh, come on, everyone knows in Europe that, just like the Reichstag, that the soldiers were killed by the Germans.
Well, but the interesting, I think that it was not until Gorbachev came along and he and his government declared that, first they declared that the Soviets had done it, Stalin and company had shot all the Poles,
Right.
and then subsequently some documents were produced that seemed to, and still seem to many people, to prove it. So, a year from now, when my book on Katyn is published, maybe I'll come back and talk about that. But it's very, very interesting to sit down and go through all of the evidence about the Katyn massacre. That one issue that I mentioned here, that this mass grave in Ukraine, which was excavated in 2010, 2011, a report published subsequently, has evidently the remains of a number of people who were supposed to have been killed at Katyn before. So that kind of shook up a little bit, shook up the accepted story of the Katyn massacre. But
evidently my mother was aware of the story.
Yeah.
And to my mother,
yeah.
you know, people at the time knew this.
Yeah, well, that was the Soviet version was up until Gorbachev that the Germans had done it, and a lot of people did accept that. And one of the things that makes it so interesting is that there was these documents, and then are they forgeries? I mean, it's a kind of interesting detective story, which is why I wrote about it. I really didn't know which side I would come down on until I'd actually taken a look at the evidence. So one aspect, one kind of enjoyable aspect of doing this research is that it's fun. It's a bit like being a detective, you know, looking at all the evidence and deciding what's really going on. The bigger picture is there's this avalanche of